La Chiesa stia oggi.
It's a boy. Hear how he cries. He's healthy.
Grazio, call for Grazio. This time we'll baptize the child immediately. You never know, after what happened last time. And his name will be Francesco. I want to offer him to St. Francis of Assisi.
One day, that child, Francesco Forgione, would enter the Franciscan family and change his name to Pio, becoming Padre Pio of Pietrelcina.
Allora, Padre Pio nasce il 25 maggio del 1800.
Padre Pio was born on May 25, 1887 in Pietrelcina. That day his mother, Maria Giuseppa, or Mother Peppa as she was called, while in Piana Romana working in the fields with her husband, Grazio, went into labor. I have to go home, she told her husband as she hurried away. Back then, children were born at home, and so she gave birth to this beautiful child who she called Francesco Forgione.
A short distance away from their house is the small church of St. Anne, where Francesco was baptized the following day. His parents had already lost a child just before he could be baptized.
Pietrelcina a quei tempi era un paese prevalente.
Back then, Pietrelcina was a farming town, and St. Pio's family would have been considered small landowners. The children helped their mom and dad work the fields, including those in Piana Romana, a hamlet of Pietrelcina, where Padre Pio would go almost every day, crossing this small road called Rosary Way that connects Pietrelcina with Piana Romana.
As a child, his faith was strong. At age 5, he had his first vision in St. Anne, a vision of the heart of Jesus. The Lord had chosen him. He would tell his friends, "Don't you ever see your guardian angel? Don't you ever talk to our Holy Mother?" Of course, his friends made fun of him, calling him crazy. His vocation as a Capuchin is a beautiful story. A friar called Fra Camillo would often come begging to Pietrelcina from a nearby convent.
Any closer and you'll get a beating. I'm giving you one last chance.
Hello, Franci. So you ready, In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti.
Amen.
Lord Jesus, who through your infancy sanctified childhood, help this boy follow your footsteps and grow in wisdom and grace. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti.
Amen.
Who are they?
What, you don't recognize them?
Should I?
You're kidding me, right? That's our Heavenly Mother. and Jesus. And that one's what's it? And that one's me.
Pretty spooky, that. What's it?
Oh, the devil, you mean? Oh, I tremble whenever he appears. But he's the one who trembles whenever they're there.
Don't you play with your friends?
Sometimes, but they swear. And you won't like their company either.
I see your point, Franci. It's better to play with your toys than to be around them.
You've got a nice beard, you know. I want to be a bearded friar when I grow up, too.
Friar Camillo and Francesco had become friends. He would tell Friar Camillo, "I spoke to the Virgin Mary." Naturally, Friar Camillo was astounded and would reply, "Send her my greetings." He used to say, "I want to become a bearded friar, like Friar Camillo."
Grazio. I think your son will become a friar. Look how happy he is.
Be it God's will. But where will I find the money to pay for his studies?
Grazio decides to leave, to emigrate to the United States, to provide for his family, but also, and foremost, to guarantee that Francesco Forgione, the future Padre Pio, could fulfill his dream to study as and become a friar. This link to America is fundamental because it left a deep mark within young Francesco's heart. Nonetheless, this was a very important turning point historically, considering the astounding events that were soon to unfold.
Grazio Forgione moved to the United States. It was the end of the 19th century, and he settled in the village of Mahoningtown, Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. Here, relatives who had previously immigrated introduced him to working on a large farm. He would often think about his family, especially Francesco, whose studies he could now finance.
Sure, it will be done. Morning.
Morning. Uncle Grazio.
Paolo.
I was waiting for you. I got what we need. Paper, pen, everything.
Thank you, Paolo. It's great to know you can read and write. Your father, my dearly departed cousin, would be proud to see you here. Settled down and with a good job.
Yeah. Unfortunately, life wasn't as generous with him. Let's go. Right, Uncle Grazio. I'm ready. You dictate and I write.
Fine. What I want my family in Pietrelcina to know is that I'm fine here in America. That I've found my cousins, and I'm living with them. With their help and that of the good Lord. I've also found a job in the fields, just like in Piana Romana. And tell them the owners of this place, which here they call a farm, have already realized how good I am at working the land. The first money order should arrive in a few days. And what about you? How are you? And the children? And how are Francesco's studies going? My son wants to become a Capuchin. That's why I came here. I need to earn money to pay for his studies.
Uncle Grazio, are you sure Francesco really wants to become a friar? Has he thought it through? Why doesn't he come here instead? There are plenty of opportunities here for a young man to make money, have a career, settle down, I mean. And who knows, even become famous one day. But if he stays there, what will he be able to do?
Oh, he's sure. He's been thinking about it ever since he was a child. I hear you, but the Lord had his own plans and went and called him. And who are we to oppose our Heavenly Father?
7 years later, with help from his father, Francesco completes his studies and his novitiate, but soon after, in 1909, he returns to Pietrelcina for health reasons. But something unusual started happening. Every time he went back to the convent, his health worsened. Doctors suggested he return to his native air. So for 7 years, he went back and forth to and from Pietrelcina.
It was a mysterious illness originally diagnosed as tuberculosis, which made him dwell in Pietrelcina even after he became a friar. Everyone feared being infected, so he had to use his own chalice when he celebrated Mass or his own cutlery. But he never turned out to be contagious because that illness was and remained a true mystery. Nonetheless, he had to keep a certain distance from people.
It was perhaps this suspicion that led the provincial father not to grant the young Padre Pio permission to hear confessions for a long period, fearing he would infect churchgoers.
Doctors measured his fever, even 106, 107, 108 degrees. So much so that they had to use a thermometer for horses because the other thermometers broke. They exploded. They would say, it's impossible. It was a mysterious illness, which wanted Padre Pio there in Pietrelcina to get prepared for what would later happen in San Giovanni Rotondo. In fact, we call it Padre Pio's Bethlehem.
Pietrelcina is his place of birth, but also of his upbringing, because between one thing and another, St. Pio lived here until the age of 29. This is the place where most of the significant mystical events occurred, which marked his history as a man and as a saint.
On August the 10th, 1910, in the Cathedral of Benevento, Padre Pio was ordained a priest at the age of 23. His father was not present since he was still in America. Padre Pio often said, "If I'm a friar, I owe it to him." But his mother was there, crying at the corner of the cathedral, holding a memento with the words, "Jesus, let me be for the world, with you, both truth and life. With you is beautiful. And for you, holy priest and perfect victim," Padre Pio could hardly have imagined the deep meaning of these words.
Offer oneself as a victim. Do we really know what this means or what it implies? Offering oneself to participate in the sacrifice of Christ means great suffering for which there is no human remedy. Did Padre Pio know what was going to happen to him? We cannot know. But it is certain that he offered himself with a generosity and a love that are hard for most to conceive. 1 month after being ordained as a priest, Padre Pio receives the first stigmata at Piana Romana.
When he received the stigmata, they were the size of a penny and blood red. He prayed to the Lord to make him feel the pain, but to remove those external marks, which he considered as an obstacle, almost a shame. And indeed, the Lord did remove them, only to make them reappear in San Giovanni Rotondo, making this town Padre Pio's Calvary.
At Pietrelcina, young Padre Pio spends his days in prayer, mainly meditating on the Passion of Christ, which causes him to weep profusely. And he has mystical visions, which give him moments of great beatitude, which he describes under obedience in the letters to his spiritual fathers. But he also assists the town's parish priest with baptisms and celebrates the Mass every day. The Mass for Padre Pio is in itself an intense mystical experience. This is where his offer to be a victim, just like Jesus, culminates, to climb to Calvary together with him. People begin deserting this young, frail-looking friar's masses since they last much longer than usual. Indescribably intense moments of ecstasy and beatitude alternate with terrible, horrific experiences marked by demonic attacks.
The history of Padre Pio's conflictual relationship with the devil goes back to even before his vocation, when he was a boy. There's this episode of a pretty monstrous creature chasing after him. He feels threatened by this creature and states that this is an early manifestation of the devil attacking him. There's a large amount of correspondence between him and his spiritual fathers, in which he mentions these assaults. He describes how the demon would spite him by erasing the writing on the letters that his spiritual father would send him. It got to the point where they would have real fights, even with wrought iron bed bars, bent iron bars. These episodes tell us how far Padre Pio's fighting with the devil had gone physically. It is as if he had somehow taken upon himself much of the devil's evil and opposition as another form of intercession for the people who relied upon him.
Increasingly aware of the special grace given to Padre Pio, his superiors begin entrusting him with the spiritual direction of several people, souls as they are called, through correspondence. This marks the start of a ministry that Padre Pio will take on as a true priestly mission. Today, we can read all these letters that Padre Pio wrote from Pietrelcina during his prolonged stay from 1909 to 1916. Padre Pio wrote of the years spent at Pietrelcina, saying, "Everything happened there." Padre Pio leaves Pietrelcina, arriving at San Giovanni Rotondo on July 28, 1916. The First World War is raging, and many friars are called to the front. Padre Pio answers the call to arms several times, though he will never be asked to fight because of his poor health. While in San Giovanni Rotondo, Padre Pio takes on the spiritual direction of novices. Meanwhile, there is a growing attention from the town's faithful as they turn to him more and more for confessions and for spiritual guidance. Similar written requests multiply from other cities and towns. For them, Padre Pio is a father, and they become his spiritual children. Emanuele Brunato was among the first ones.
I don't think my father ever mentioned that he was one of Padre Pio's spiritual children.
Which is paradoxical given the fact that he's presented as Padre Pio's first spiritual son. Though it's clear that there really was a father-son bond in his history with Padre Pio. His youth was particularly turbulent. In 1919, my father was living in Naples when he read the first published article about Padre Pio. He spent the last of his money to take a train. He got off at the wrong station, San Severo, and had to walk 40 kilometers at night. He was 28 at the time, and his whole life passed by him as he climbed the Gargano and reached the convent, a tiny one with only 5 friars out in the middle of nowhere.
Jusqu'à l'arrivée devant le couvent. C'est un petit couvent de 5 moines, donc vraiment.
He asks a churchgoer, "Who is Padre Pio?"
Il va demander à une personne à l'entrée de l'église, qui est Padre Pio?
And the person points him in a direction, saying, "It's the friar down there." He looks at the friar and thinks, "Really? I've come this far just for this?"
Le Padre Pio lève la tête.
Padre Pio and my father exchange glances, and this stuns him. There's no other way to put it.
Foudroyé, on ne pourrait pas dire autrement.
He feels something like a shock and runs away.
Et il va partir en courant.
My father used to recount that he went away. He ran along the convent, crying and saying, "My Lord and my God."
Enfin, c'est très émouvant parce que
It's very moving because I relive this every time I recount or read it, because it's a story that completely changed his life. When he later returned to the convent in silence, he saw Padre Pio and realized that no, he wasn't the terrible man he had imagined.
Et finalement, il aperçoit que, non.
On the contrary, he was a welcoming Capuchin friar with, shall we say, an affectionate look about him.
Voilà un regard presque affectueux qui va l'emporter.
As would always happen with Padre Pio, my father's encounter with him began at the confessional.
Il va commencer par le confessionnal.
And this is the beginning of a great story.
During the Second World War, poverty takes its toll on San Giovanni Rotondo. The town's children are left without a school as it becomes occupied by the Germans. They wander around the town, often reaching the convent in search of something to do, but more often just looking for something to eat.
My mother would go to Mass and confess to Padre Pio, even though the war was raging. Padre Pio used to celebrate Mass as early as 4 in the morning. When the Germans arrived, they occupied the school, and we didn't go to school anymore. We'd go around near the convent to look for something to eat. One day a friar, who was the Capuchin superior, asked us, "What are you doing, children? Why don't you come here and learn to serve Mass for Padre Pio?" When Mass was over, we'd kiss Padre Pio's hands. We'd do it before and after Mass. And sometimes we were naughty and we'd ask him if we could kiss his hands on both sides, both of them. And Padre Pio would smile and give us an affectionate pat. It was like that.
Years later, thanks to a series of fortuitous events, that boy became Padre Pio's photographer.
What's that thing there?
Hey, Padre Pio. This takes photographs.
What do you know about photographs?
How about this? Let me take some of you.
Come on, as if you knew how to use that.
Wait. Just one. Come on, let's try. Hey? You should turn towards the light. That's beautiful. Thank you very much.
So the following day, I would show them to him, and he would say, "You've made me look bad." And I'd reply, "Hey, Padre Pio, what do you expect if you stand like a policeman?" He'd make funny remarks and comments, and I'd answer back. I used the familiar form of the Italian you. Our bond was strong. It was as if Padre Pio were my dad. One day my teacher says, "Elia, if you bring me a photo of Padre Pio while he's giving the blessing, I'll give you 5,000 lira." And who'd ever seen 5,000 lira? The first electronic flash had just come out. It weighed 30 kilos. I went and took the photo with the flash, and Padre Pio shouted, "Who's that guy there? Call the police! Have him arrested!" I was mortified.
I'm so sorry, Padre Pio. I didn't think you'd get angry over a photograph.
I was you. Oh, don't take any more. You nearly blinded me. I could have fallen from the altar.
Fine. I won't take any more. My teacher, he should come and take his own.
If that's the way things are, take as many as you like. But without the flesh. Without that mousetrap.
But Padre Pio, the flash is necessary. There are only 2 candles on the altar.
Take as many as you like. Don't worry. But without that camera flash. Don't worry. Take as many as you like. Don't worry.
Saddened, Elia almost wants to give up photography, but instead decides to take some more photos during First Communions.
I took 7 or 8 photographs because I wanted to show Padre Pio how the film would turn out to be white if the flash wasn't there. As I started developing the photographs, I could see some shadows. As I developed the film, I noticed that the photos of the First Communions looked like they had been taken out in the sun. Why should I show them to him, I thought. He was the photographer here, not me. And this is indeed a mystery. He was right to tell me, take as many as you like, because he was the one who set up the light. He set it up.
Among those who went to San Giovanni Rotondo during this period to meet and get to know Padre Pio, often attending Mass, were many American soldiers. They were stationed in Foggia and the nearby vicinity during the Second World War.
You know, I did not know a lot of in-depth about Padre Pio until I started reading up on him as someone who served in the Italian army in World War I, but then after the priesthood and all that became a very holy, saintly person to our American military during World War II. And the American GIs would seek him out, almost do pilgrimages to attend his masses. Padre Pio had a very specific love for the American GI and was obviously very grateful to the American GIs who freed Italy from fascism and Nazism. There's a book called Padre Pio and America, which is a book that I read after I really started to look into Padre Pio and who he was and what he stood for and why he was a saint. William Kerrigan, a devout Catholic, was the director of the American Red Cross field office in Foggia, where he had been assigned to support the 15th Air Force. Kerrigan was one of many GIs who had heard the accounts of the holy priest. When some of the troops stationed with Kerrigan wanted to visit Padre Pio, they asked him if he could provide transportation up the mountain. He agreed, and on a snowy day in the winter of 1943-44, he and about 20 GIs made the trek to Our Lady of Grace Friary. By the time the group arrived at the church, Padre Pio's Mass had already begun. Kerrigan was struck by the friar's profound holiness, his intense suffering during the Mass, and the way he seemed to be directly communicating with God. When the Mass was over, the Americans were received warmly by Padre Pio in the sacristy. Padre Pio reportedly told Kerrigan that these were the first American soldiers that he had met during the war. Over the next year and a half, the Red Cross director furnished transportation for hundreds of soldiers who wished to attend Padre Pio's Mass. He witnessed the transformation in the lives of many of these GIs, and some were even called to the priesthood.
At that time, I was at the Pontifical Roman Seminary, and there was this alumnus, and he had just been made Archbishop, and he said, well, now I'm going to Padre Pio. And naturally, I was 20 years old, and I said, oh boy, what an experience. I said, that would be so wonderful. Santa Maria della Grazia was a small church. There were so many people waiting outside. We started the Mass. We went on. We did not realize, none of us, but even the people in the relatively small church there realized that the time was passing by. He would go into ecstasy. And I looked at my watch. It was 9:30. 3 hours of Mass, but we didn't realize where 3 hours had passed. You know, it was an incredible experience.
Io lo portavo sotto il braccio la mattina.
In the morning, I'd accompany him from his cell to the sacristy, and as we were about to reach the door that led from the hall to the sacristy, I'd suddenly feel him shake like a leaf, and he would stop dead in his tracks, like a statue. Then he slowly started walking again. So we once asked him, Father, why does this happen to you? Because I must enter the king's tent. Moses, I must enter the king's tent. Jesus' presence within the Eucharist engulfed him, penetrated him, moved him.
Then he would take out his handkerchief and dry his first morning tears. When his heart and his mind lingered on the Eucharist, he would melt like wax before a fire. And from my perspective, I'd enjoy this sight. I couldn't see within the man's soul, but so much transpired nonetheless.
Padre Pio that morning was really suffering a lot. He turns to me, kneeling down. He said, Giovanotto, senti, today I don't feel so good. Do you mind if you take me to my cell? We walked and we start talking. And for an hour, he gave me actually what I would do in the future, which I had never had in mind to do. And so that was something that I did not expect. And sure enough, everything happened the way he told me. And I had this continuous, I would say, spiritual contact with Padre Pio.
I'd like to tell the story of Graham Greene, who was an English novelist of the 20th century. Some say he was the finest writer of the 20th century. He described himself as a Catholic atheist. Now that sounds like a real contradiction, and in a sense it is. But he said there were two strands that had kept him identifying as a Catholic. One was the story in John's Gospel, the 20th chapter, when Mary Magdalene runs from the tomb to tell the apostles that the tomb was empty. And he said that story is so convincing from the Gospel that he was really a believer in the resurrection of Jesus. The other incident, the other strand, was one of Masses of Padre Pio. And he said he was so struck by the image of Padre Pio, by his humility, by his holiness. He saw Christ in Padre Pio. And that was the other thing that convinced him that he should not be an atheist.
At one point, Padre Pio was hearing confessions for more than 12 hours a day. Thousands of pilgrims would flock to his confessional, having reserved well in advance.
A few times I had this experience. If I forgot some small venial sin, he would say, "On Thursday morning at 8, you said this and this to that person." We were an open book to him. At first this made us uneasy, but later we all realized that it was a great benefit to us and a great gift for him, because after absolution you'd get up and truly go in peace, and your soul unblemished, just like a wedding gown.
Rumors circulated that Padre Pio was grumpy and short-tempered.
This prejudice mainly circulated among those who had never met him. Well, it was only gossip. So therefore, he shouted at me. Oh, he's grumpy. Oh, he kicks people out. But none of it was true. Padre Pio indeed sent some penitents away, but only because they weren't penitent at all. Because sometimes he indeed would tell them, "Go, and when you're ready, come back and confess your sins."
It's quite common to see, and it almost shocks me to find on Wikipedia pictures showing Padre Pio with a sad face, which may make one imagine that he was taciturn. But when you read, for example, my father's stories about living with Padre Pio, you find he was anything but a quiet person. He was actually the joking type.
This jovial aspect was part of Padre Pio's personality, and those who knew him closely will tell you he would joke to lighten up the mood so that the suffering he was experiencing wouldn't be a burden to the friars.
After dinner, the friars would wait for him to tell jokes, as he often would. He could be a very funny and witty man.
His skills as a funny storyteller were at the highest level. Among those who testified to this was Italian actor Carlo Campanini, who felt like a rookie next to Padre Pio. Many show business personalities were deeply touched after meeting with Padre Pio. Some radically changed their way of life and became true disciples of the friar. One of his spiritual children was internationally renowned tenor Beniamino Gigli. He was often seen singing Ave Maria before Padre Pio, as well as other more popular songs like Mamma, which used to bring tears to Padre Pio's eyes. Unfortunately, not everyone was so well inclined towards Padre Pio.
Some people came to spite Padre Pio in many ways. Like true adversaries, whereas some would gather to see or touch his stigmata, some would even step on his toes. Others would cut his cord just out of spite. As he walked along corridors, normally no one would do that. And so it was clear, those who carried out these actions had well prepared for them. And usually, Padre Pio was a man of such incredible sweetness, of an extraordinary sweetness.
Padre Pio's is a story of a man who has been scrutinized, subjected to many exams and many accusations. They said he made the stigmata himself with carbolic acid, when there's actually no acid that would keep a wound fresh and open for an entire lifetime. During his long life, 2 very dark periods reduced him to silence, to live in isolation away from the faithful. The first one dates back to the 1930s, following accusations related to the stigmata linked to Father Agostino Gemelli, a man who hardly esteemed Padre Pio and wrote extremely negative reports about him. For over 700 days, Padre Pio obeyed and remained in silent confinement within the convent.
When Professor Giorgio Festa came, he started to analyze him. He was skeptical about some of these things. He'd come here almost every week to take samples, and when he visited Padre Pio, he'd put a gauze through his sores from one side to the other. The stigmata gave Padre Pio continuous hemorrhages. He was always bleeding.
There was a second wave of accusations in the 60s, during the papacy of St. John the 23rd. These accusations were debunked as well, and after Paul VI's pontificate, the accusations were dropped.
At one point, they sent Father Rosario from Ali Minuzzi, who confined Padre Pio, worse than in a jail. He set up a small corridor for the friar to pass through to reach the confessional and then come back. So Padre Pio couldn't go really anywhere else.
It is important to say how Padre Pio, as a true saint, stood in the face of these accusations, even though they were unjust. He suffered in silence, certainly defending himself, but he never opposed any measure that was imposed on him. So in some way, he was an example of how to obey, even when the Church made inappropriate choices.
In 1967, for the anniversary of the stigmata of Padre Pio, my magazine, a weekly magazine called Gente, called me and sent me as a correspondent to write an article. There must have been 20,000 people, and that was a bit of a problem for me because I came from the Catholic University of Sacred Heart, and I remembered how Father Gemelli had always been an opponent and had expressed such negative judgments that the Church had practically condemned Padre Pio 6 times. I got up early that morning, at about 4 o'clock, because the Mass was at 5, and I struggled to enter the church because it was already full. And while I was walking around, I noticed a very strange scent. I moved, and the scent was still there. I moved again, and it was still there. I thought that since that particular scent associated to Padre Pio was so popular, the friars had let it in from some vent in the church to help people believe in Padre Pio. So I turned to the people around me, and I asked, "Can you smell this?" "Yes, it's Padre Pio's scent." While another said, "I can't smell anything." I went around and asked about 20 people and thought, how come some people can smell it and some people can't? When the Mass was over, I hastened to the sacristy entrance. Padre Pio was kneeling alone at the faldstool, praying. When he finished, he got up and approached the people in the sacristy. Afterwards, he came to me. He asked what my name was and all that, and shook my hand. I thought, and let's feel this hand. And I pressed it like this, and he let out a scream. You see, I thought, there's probably something under his gloves.
A few months later, Renzo Allegri returned to San Giovanni Rotondo. A Jesuit, Father Mason, had confidentially told him about Padre Pio's miraculous healing that had occurred after the statue of Our Lady of Fatima visited San Giovanni Rotondo in 1959. He wanted to verify this news directly with Padre Pio and went again to see him.
The superior told me, no, Padre Pio is praying. It was around noon. You shouldn't disturb him. But then he added, look, pretend I didn't see you coming. That's the staircase that leads upstairs. Go up, and through the hallway, Padre Pio is in the choir. I went up through this long hallway. Typical of convents, I heard a door creak, and a frail man came in. He must have been a meter and a half tall, old and bent, like this. He was staying close to the wall with his hand like this. He took 2 steps forward and stopped, breathing hard. He looked more dead than alive. I was so touched, I couldn't even take a picture. Nothing. I lowered my eyes. I saw his legs all swollen. I couldn't bear to imagine this level of suffering. When he approached me, he looked at me. I said, Padre Pio, I've come to greet you. He put his hand on my shoulder to steady himself. It felt like a vice. He probably had no strength in his legs to hold himself up. He spoke, finally, how are you? Where are you from? I bring greetings from Father Mazon, who told me, and I told him all I knew. Is it true you were healed by Our Lady? With silence. I repeated, is it true that? I kept asking while recording him. I wanted some sort of confirmation, 3 or 4 times, and then he burst into tears. It was terrible. He was really crying, and then, still crying, he said, yes, yes, Our Lady healed me. Our Lady healed me. He changed the subject while I slowly accompanied him to his cell. He asked me a lot of things about myself. Then, when we arrived at the door of the cell, he went in. He said his goodbye, but stopped to look at me for a long time. And that's all.
Padre Pio truly was a man of faith and healing. Thousands of people turned to him to receive the miracle of healing, both spiritually and physically, either for themselves or for those they held dear. Often there was no need to ask explicitly for his intercession.
One day, Padre Pio saw him in the outer courtyard. My father was sitting on a small wall, so he asked him, "What are you doing here?" He replied, "I'm waiting for someone to pick me up on the back of a mule and take me back to town because I have an infection in my foot. I cannot walk, so someone has to take me." And Padre Pio said, "No, go home on foot." Obediently, my father started walking. He walked for 2 kilometers, all the way home in San Giovanni. He arrived, took his shoes off, and his foot had healed.
Among the healed, there was Gemma di Giorgi, born without pupils. Her grandmother took her from Sicily to San Giovanni Rotondo to ask Padre Pio for a miracle. The little girl got her sight back, though she still has no pupils to this day.
When the grandmother saw that the girl could see perfectly, but her eyes still looked as bad as before, she said, "Now I'll deal with this," as a good Sicilian. And so she went to confess and told Padre Pio, "Father, I thank you because the girl can now see. But as you can understand, she is a girl. She's growing. What will she do one day with those ugly eyes?" And Padre Pio replied, "If you have something to confess, then do it. Otherwise, don't waste my time. She can now see better than you can." Why did he reply in that way? Because such a healing, the gift of sight without pupils, is still a proof today of the miracle that took place. If everything had returned to normal, some doubts may have arisen. And this way, neither science nor medicine could have returned her pupils to normal. So certain miracles may seem incomplete, but are far greater than all others in importance.
Young Karol Wojtyła, the future Saint Pope John Paul II, also entrusted himself to the intercession of Padre Pio.
It begins between the end of March and early April 1948. Karol Wojtyła has recently been ordained a priest and goes to San Giovanni Rotondo together with a fellow student. We know that Padre Pio told Father Karol Wojtyła about a wound that hurt him most. A wound no one knew about. It was an ecchymosis on his shoulder, the wound the cross left on Jesus. Padre Pio also had this sign, and this is a matter that is only pertinent to the relationship between Padre Pio and John Paul II, the future John Paul II. As a bishop, he was in touch with Padre Pio. He asked for prayers and for his intercession for someone. Other than the well-known story of Wanda Poltawska, who recently passed away, a friend of Karol Wojtyła's, healed from a cancer on the abdomen, there are many others. The future Pope trusted in Padre Pio and entrusted people to his prayers.
Padre Pio is constantly with me. I always carry one of his gloves with a small cloth with me. This belonged to him. Sometimes approaching the glove to the sick, thanks to the glove and the people's faith, I've seen physical healings happen. And for this, I'm grateful to the Lord and to Padre Pio as well, who's always by my side, just like a guardian angel.
New prodigious facts about him are being discovered every day.
Probably it's the first time that I'm saying this. You know, the doctors had told me that I had 3 months to live. One night, when that was really the peak of my kind of therapy, I was ready to give up. But then something happened. I figured, some of my people, would come and stay with me during the night, probably see if And so I told my nephew, I said, the following morning, I said, thank you for being with me during the night. And he said, no, I have never been with you. And naturally, that was January, February, it was kind of cold. And next to me, there was this person who with a hood, and so I have to assume that he was with me, because after that, I felt all right. I went through it, and as I said, I have never been so busy ever since.
My experience with Padre Pio was when I was 16 years old. I had known about him, heard about him. My family was a family of faith. And there was a gentleman named Joey Lamagino who used to go around Long Island, and he talked to Padre Pio and do the rosaries. And I had gotten deathly ill right after football season. I went to Seton Hall High School. I was in the hospital for 3 months. They didn't know what I had, and I was basically wasting away. I had said to my mom, do you think we can have Joey Lamagino get in touch with Padre Pio for me? This gentleman, Joey Lamagino, went to San Giovanni Rotonda in Foggia, Italy, and he went to confession with Padre Pio. He was blinded when he was a young man, maybe 11 years old. A tire blew up in his face and cut his olfactory nerves and his vision. And he said when he went to confession with Pio, Pio told him his sins. He says, what about this and what about that? So it wasn't just something I read about or my family read. It was someone who experienced the miracle of Padre Pio, because when Padre Pio blessed him, he said to him, you will have new sight. And he hadn't had a scent for many, many years. And he got the sense of smell that almost, exploded in his senses. So knowing this, I said to my mom, do you think Joey Lamagino can have Padre Pio pray for me or ask him what might be wrong? And he did. And a telegram was sent back. And I'm in the hospital, don't forget. And it said, pray blessings, I'm no doctor, because no one knew what I had. My mother that week dreamt of the Mass, of Padre Pio's Mass. And in the hospital, I had the scent of incense. There was a scent, roses, incense. A week later, on a Saturday morning, the doctor was Dr. Eugene Teisch. He said to my mother, he said, Mary, if you told me your son would be in this shape a week ago, I'd say only a miracle. Padre Pio was in my life. I feel like I'm a spiritual child of Padre Pio. I have a devotion to him. I've spread it with other people, friends of mine who were ill. Not only that, I had family members that had a terrible addiction to drugs, and they shouldn't be saved. But I prayed to him and he saved them. He helped them. Through my own personal experience, I can absolutely, they call Padre Pio a man of hope and healing. When you experience that and you give that to other people, there's something you feel very close to Christ through Padre Pio.
The concrete sign, still tangible today, of Padre Pio's immense love for humanity, the humanity that flocked to him for any type of suffering and disease, is the home for the relief of suffering.
In 1940, during the Second World War, he said, I want to build a hospital right there. He said as he pointed to a rocky hillside. It seemed like madness, but saints sometimes look like madmen. The hospital was indeed built. It all started with a small donation, and then, well, I guess charity fascinates people.
My father intervened in the start of the construction of the Home for the Relief of Suffering. At the time, and we're talking about 1941, my father saw to it that the hospital received an initial payment of 3,500,000 francs, which would now be several million euros. This is fairly well known to some historians. What is less known is what my stepsister, Felicienne, told me, that while she was going to San Giovanni with my father, her mother had put some banknotes in her coat, in the lining of her jacket, so that he could also take a certain amount of funds directly in cash. The story starts there, with a servant going. Padre Pio sends him to France with an industrial project. He returned with the money he'd raised during the period of occupation, withdrawn from the Germans.
Many doctors made themselves available, but he always said, "Home for the relief of suffering." You, he would say to the doctors, have a mission to cure the sick. But be careful. If you don't bring them love, your drugs will be of no use. Bring God to the sick. This will do them much more than any medicine.
The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration and the U.S. government were fundamental in supporting the completion of the hospital by facilitating the receipt of hundreds of millions of lira given in the name of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, as testified by the memorial plaque located at the hospital's entrance. And the Home for the Relief of Suffering is still there today to testify to Padre Pio's great charity and his desire to bring God's mercy to everyone.
La casa sollievo della sofferenza è al completo. Ringrazio i benefattori di ogni parte del mondo che hanno cooperato. Questa è la creatura che la provvidenza aiutata da voi ha creato, ve la presento. Ammiratela e beneditela insieme a me il Signore Dio.
I think the aspects that most fascinated me about Padre Pio is the fact the humbleness, the humanity. If Padre Pio, let's say, had been born into the lap of luxury and was this very wealthy son of a king or a duke or a very wealthy family, it's easier to justify that or explain it away if indeed you're talking about somebody who comes from that background. But if you're talking about somebody who doesn't come from that background, I guess again that's where faith comes into play, because there are some things that in a way are all unexplainable.
I like the work that Padre Pio did. Well, I never met Padre Pio except in a dream. And, well, the memory that he left in my mind was so much that he's always with me. There's nothing I can do about it, you know? It's like he's always there.
His engaging smile and simple humility draw everyone to him. Often the soldiers are taken separately to a side room where Padre Pio blesses their rosaries and other objects and answers questions through interpreters. On the way back to the base, the soldiers seem like changed men. Once at the camp, they continue to think and talk about him and spread the word to their buddies, who now also want to meet him. Spiritual values are taking root, and many of the men turn from their carefree attitude and begin soberly to consider their future responsibilities and relationship with God. So Padre Pio had a gigantic, enormous effect on so many, but the American GI he has had a special relationship with, and for many of them, he was a saving grace in getting them through the war.
St. Pio's legacy continues to spread around the world, and many associations, groups, and foundations have been created in his name. In the United States, the St. Pio Foundation was founded by Luciano La Monarca, an Italian opera singer and humanitarian, during a time when he and his wife Valentina were experiencing several challenges in becoming parents.
It's hard to explain the feeling I have now thinking 10 years back. The initiative comes because in our life we had a very difficult and challenging moment. On December 3rd, 2010, our stillborn Alma was brought to life, but she didn't survive. Through that moment, through experiencing that hardship, through experiencing that sorrow, we got closer to St. Pio. In May 15, 2011, I wanted to go back to my root. I wanted to recharge myself in my faith. We went and then we met St. Pio at his tomb in San Giovanni on the first anniversary of our wedding. I believe that was the first sign of a series of events that would have then brought me to found the St. Pio Foundation.
Since 2017, the St. Pio Foundation has organized public venerations of the relics of St. Pio, which have allowed many thousands of faithful, unable to travel to San Giovanni Rotondo and Pietrelcina, the opportunity to pray to the beloved saint and ask for his intercession.
The St. Pio Foundation is establishing 5 different chapels across the United States, one in the very center, one in the north, in the south, the east, and the west, to form a cross across the United States. Every one of these St. Pio chapels is a place of encounter with Padre Pio.
We just presented a life-size statue of St. Pio's in Newcastle, in Pennsylvania, where Grazia Forgione lived. That was the replica of the statue, I Embrace You, we presented in Piana Romana in September 2021 on a plaza dedicated to the people of the United States of America.
The idea for the sculpture was really to symbolize St. Padre Pio and his connection towards Christ.
In January 2024, a number of initiatives were launched by the St. Pio Foundation to celebrate the 25th anniversary of St. Pio's beatification and its own 10th anniversary. The foundation made freely available to the public several letters written by Padre Pio to his spiritual directors and spiritual children, as well as 10 unpublished photographs of St. Pio. It also sponsored a new rendition of The Song of St. Pio, originally composed by Rico Garofalo in 1968, the year Padre Pio passed away. In addition, to help families in need, the St. Pio Foundation launched Pizza for a Smile, an international food initiative donating freshly made pizzas to nourish the poor and affirm their dignity.
Everyone loves has a pizza moment where they're sharing with people that they love. Where I grew up, where getting a slice was something that provided more than just a warm meal. It provided happiness. Even for a moment as a kid.
People, they are really suffering. Some people out there who don't even know it. It feels heartwarming for them that somebody actually cares about them.
The possibilities are endless. We're not saints. We'll just challenge them to make things better than we found them.
I'm a great supporter of the Pio Foundation, have been from very early years, because they are very effective in telling the Padre Pio story, bringing his life alive to many believers and non-believers. And I hope that this documentary will go a long way in fostering that devotion and in telling the story which needs to be told.
The pious one.